I'm talking about today comes out of my book called She Who Hunts, Artemis, the Goddess That Changed the World. There's a QR code if you want to read more about it. And there'll be QR codes for different things. I don't know, I've become a bit QR code obsessed. And I will manually go through these slides. There we go. Okay. So the origins of the cult of the goddess Artemis are quite obscure. There is a distinction in Artemis from region to region, from site to site. Today we're going to talk about Sparta and Buron. In order to be able to distinguish in which of her characters she was worshipped, at which site, it is necessary to briefly discuss the most important ones. Mother of the Gods is one of her names, Goddess of the Wilderness, Goddess of Hunting, Goddess of Animals, Goddess of Births, Infants and Children, and the Goddess of Youths and Marriage. She plays a key role in the rites of passage of young people. Her name also appears in Phrygian inscriptions from the 7th century BCE, where she is often called Mother, even though she herself has no children. She's also later on labeled Mother of the Gods in Rome. We're using the word mater or mater deus later on. In other literature, there are several additional variants in describing her. Goddess of the wilderness, animals, and hunting, of course, in modern scholarship. But Artemis is most commonly known as a goddess of hunting. She is usually depicted in this way, as a young maiden wearing a short dress, often with a bow and arrow and deer or dogs at her feet. Hunters used to honor her by hanging their equipment or their horns and skins of their prey on a tree or any other special place. In the Homeric poems, Artemis is reduced, in my opinion, to a girl, a maiden. In ancient literature, for example, in the Iliad, she's an adolescent girl, besides others like Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena, even though she is often called Agroterra and Padniatheron. In the Odyssey, she's presented quite differently, showering arrows, delighting in boars, and hinds, delighting in the wild hunt with her nymphs, dancing and playing in the forest. In the hymns to Artemis, she is a strong, fierce character, making the tops of the high mountains tremble and the tangled wood echo awesomely with the outcry of beasts. So she has a really interesting history because she is at once a young maiden or an adolescent, and she's at the same time the terror that trembles mountains, which is why I find her so fascinating. With the hunt, there is also a wildness in her behavior. So things like arrows, and she has a boldness of heart. She destroys races of wild beasts. She slays wild beasts. In the Homeric hymn to Artemis, she is often associated with wildlife and terror. In her cults, however, other aspects or characteristics are much more prominent and important. In the Peloponnese, she was a nature goddess and a mistress of animals, taking care of fertility of the land and its inhabitants. In Boeotia and Attica, she was a helper in childbirth and marriage. A good example will be when we talk about the Broronian sanctuary, where women offered their garments to Artemis Broronia after childbirth. So let's talk about the importance of rites of passage. So rites of passage are secret and mysterious, as is made clear in 3 stages. The rite of separation, followed by the rite of transition, and the rite of reincorporation. And so young people, both male and female, would pass through a rite of separation from their family, the rite of transition, which would be the ritual, and then a rite of reincorporation back into the community. This initiation involves the reintegration into a group of people who are alike, and it marked a profound change in the individual, and it was irreversible. So once you went through a rites of passage, you could not go back. In Greece, the goddess Artemis was concerned with the maturing of children. She played an important role in their upbringing, and especially in the last part of their journey to adulthood through a rite of passage. For boys, this was one stage through which they were supported by Artemis. For girls, it was a little different. Artemis supported girls towards their adulthood, but then she again supported women in getting married and becoming a mother. So for girls, coming of age meant that they had to pass through the 3 stages of transition and other rites of passages moving forward. As a result, Artemis then provides over the delivery, birth, the upbringing of children, the standing between the wild and the tame, and the adulthood of young people. She raises children from their wild, unformed state to maturity, crossing the threshold for citizenship and marriage. Children were set to a series of trials which had to be completed in the context of the wild. Artemis had sanctuary at borders and different parts of land and sea. These sanctuaries were often in the margins, in between city and the wild. However, Sparta is listed as one of the exceptions. So, in Sparta, Artemis or Thea was the main cult goddess. This cult added a religious aspect to the rite of passage. One of the purposes of this rite at Sparta was concerned with the installing of correct behavior, especially of young boys, imparting information and integrating the children in a new group, as it is demonstrated later on also in Braron. In addition, Artemis made sure that boys and girls embarked correctly on their quest to learn the model to which they one day would have to conform. The significance of the rites of passage for boys was the preparation for both the condition of a warrior and marriage, and for girls, the preparation for marriage and childbirth. War was for boys what marriage was for girls. A remarkable fact about the male and female initiations is that while the rituals appear to follow initiatory patterns, the participants are not an entire age class, but only a few, mostly aristocratic representatives of that class. Plutarch shows us that Artemis practiced the nurture of the young in the zone of the wild. On the one side of the initiation rites relied on children's innocence and play. On the other side, they involved intimidation and ritual terrorization, carried out by the use of masks, ritual wounding, and sometimes even death. This illustrates the wild character of the goddess and the zone of the wild in which the initiation took place. The initiation was sometimes, or in the past, associated by human sacrifices made to the goddess, which are known from many literary and archaeological sources. For example, the secret performance of the Crypteia for the Spartan boys took place in the fields and forests away from the community. They were only equipped with daggers and supplies that were necessary. During the day, they hid themselves, and by night, they killed the helots they caught. Artemis is also known as a bloodthirsty goddess, specifically Artemis or Thea. Some of the blood that associates... Let's get to the blood when we get to Baronia. We'll do the blood of the boys first. So there are 2 stories about the wooden image of Orthia. Pausanias tells us about the wooden image of Artemis Orthia, which was said to have been found in a thicket of willows. There's another story in which Orestes and Iphigenia stole out of the Tauric land the cult image of Orthia. So there's 2 stories to them. Pausanias agrees with that and says that story is more probable because Orestes was a king and therefore Iphigenia would not leave behind an image of Artemis. The wooden statue of Artemis Orthia at Sparta could easily be dressed in different animal skins and a helmet. However, a bow and spear also seem quite likely. There's lots of other evidence that say that this statue was dressed depending on which ritual was taking place. We also know there's a long connection between Artemis and trees. There are many wooden cult image stories of Artemis and other goddesses, and these cult images were said to be small and light so that a priestess could hold them, particularly at Sparta. A close look at the artifacts found in the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia implies that the goddess was identical in her earlier stage, that there may have been an Orthia separate goddess and an Artemis separate goddess that somehow became syncretized over time, certainly around 545 BCE. The ritual for boys. The first human activity in the Artemis Orthia sanctuary is represented by a layer of blackened earth, and there's about 30 square meters, which was accompanied by geometric pottery shards and other small pieces of bronzes. We know that this was one of the first layers where traces of bone can be found. These are the remains of burned animals, most probably sacrifices to the goddess Artemis Orthia. There are other, of course, layers of artifacts and soil that were analyzed. Artemis Orthia is also associated with other animals such as lions. Lions and horses were a well-known attribute for Poinia Theron, or the mistress of animals. The rites of passage for young males marked their entry into status as a citizen or a warrior. The start of this transition process was the separation of the initiates from their parents, which marked the break with childhood. Young people led a life separate from their community for a period of time before their definitive admission into the military force. Often they had to begin with a probationary period, living in the wild like animals, and mastering the skills that normally are expected of other hunters. In the description that Pausanias gives us of the rites of Artemis Orthia in Sparta, involves a passage ceremony that was for males only. Dancing with weapons was part of this ceremony and required at Sparta of boys from the 7 years onward as training before engaging in actual military combat. There is some discussion about at what age they started. Some people argue they started at 5 years old, 7 years old. Either way, they were very familiar with this dance that took place. But the test of manhood, according to Euripides, Iphigenia, and Taurus, and Pausanias too, happened in front of the image of Artemis Orthia and always requested a type of human sacrifice. So tradition states that some quarrel or competition among the earliest tribes of Sparta led to violence and death around the altar of Artemis. After the slaughter, there was a plague, and the oracle prescribed that the altar always be soaked in blood. And the citizens selected an individual by lot who would be the human sacrifice. However, this tradition was thought to be barbaric after a time, and the ritual was adapted by Lycurgus, so that boys were scourged or whipped at her altar in such a manner that it became sprinkled with their blood, but they did not necessarily have to die. This ceremony was believed to have been introduced in the place of human sacrifice, and it was not boys who were scourged, but warriors. And instead of one of them dying, they could all bleed together. This is a very Spartan ritual, and it involves physical sacrifice in the sacred place of the divine. Most interestingly, the ritual of the community is inscribed on the body of the citizens, of the boys, and denies differences, both natural and cultural, so that all men and warriors were treated equally. Plutarch does tell us that some deaths did occur, that they were not infrequent, but that was mostly due to the fervorance of the participants, how much they whipped themselves and each other. There's also another story, actually, that links back to this cheese competition that we're told that at some point for Artemis Orthia, they would run this festival where the boys had to steal cheese from the altar. They would place cheese on the altar, and the boys had to steal a piece of cheese. And as the boys ran up to steal the piece of cheese, someone else would be whipping them as well. So there would be some type of blood sacrifice for cheese. So one team attempted to steal the cheese, piled on the other, while the other wielded whips against them. Pausanias tells us that such a test of endurance in which the boys were whipped so that the blood fell on the altar, while the priestess of Artemis stood holding this ancient wooden statue. If the men wielding the whips were too merciful, the statue became heavier in her hands. The boys who withstood the most punishment were called the victors at the altar. Let's talk about Brawn for girls. In opposition to boys, girls were protected by Artemis at several stages in life. Each time the girl transited from one stage towards another, Artemis was present. First, there was the education for girls that led them to become adults. Then when the girls got married and and abandoned the virgin goddess, and lastly in childbirth, when the protection of Artemis was needed for both mother and child. So the sanctuary of Artemis Epeironia is of great importance, especially for aristocratic girls, and especially aristocratic girls of Athens who would travel there. The sanctuary was the theater for rites of passage for girls in the Arctea. The Arctea is represented in ceramic finds. You can visit the Beiron Museum. It's full of pieces that represent both the girls participating in the ritual and Artemis herself. The young girls were called Arctoi, and they were part of a procession that took off from Athens and came to Beiron. That's about an hour drive, so it's a long walk. The Arctoi, the young women, were offered to Artemis as priestesses. Once every 5 years, there were festivals with music, sports, horse races. The purpose of the Arctea was for the girls to pass from girlhood or wildness to a marriageable age. And like at Sparta, dances were a major part of this social function. Unlike at the sanctuary of Sparta or Ephesus, Beiron does not feature any rites of passages for boys. This is only a girl transition space. And girls' transitions at the Artemis cults had completely different meanings than rites for the passage for boys. Transition rites for girls desired transformation that resulted in the girl's readiness to assume the social role of wife and mother. And so this is sort of a move backwards in the sense that the girls were seen to be wild and rambunctious and playful and jumping around, and they went through this passage to become more desirable as wives and mothers, where the boys performed rituals that also were a form of transition, but it transitioned them in perhaps more aggression, perhaps even more violence, and preparing them for war. The transition for the girls also began with the separation of the initiative from her mother, which symbolized the break with childhood and the world that was regarded as maternal and asexual. The transition required the girls to participate in the rites held at sacred places. They were isolated from the community. The girls were placed under the care of a guardian, whose task it was to take care of the physical needs and to instruct her in the secrets of fertility and sexuality, and teach her the accepted responsibilities of a woman. Virgins attaining a state of matrimony had to die for Artemis first. And so there's this idea that the childness of the girl died in this ritual. The girls had to discard their status of Parthenos for Artemis. However, their physical status and their social status of a woman did not always coincide. A girl could be Parthenos until her marriage, even if she had already borne a child. Alternatively, the status of bride or nymph could last well after the wedding until the birth of their first child. When girls became adults, they left Artemis's protection, which only went as far as childhood, and then resumed in her character as Eileithyia when the women were to become mothers. And this is when Artemis steps in as a role of protector of childbirth. And so often at Beiron, what we will also find is that women left things like their girdles, sometimes their placentas, sometimes the clothing of children in preparation or post-birth. So they left sacrifices for the goddess that would ensure a safe and live birth. The ceramics that were found in Beiron have the girls bearing torches, a sign that rituals took place at night. And we have numerous examples in which the girls' sacrifices and girls' rituals took place at night, while the boys tended to take place during the day. Herodotus tells us that there's many nighttime festivals that celebrate this transition for girls from wildness into marriageable age. There is something associated with night and wildness and sort of what goes on in the dark, particularly for women, which I argue remains a mystery for many, compared to daytime. And most of the rituals, particularly at Sparta, were for boys were done during the day. This procession was held for Artemis was held every 4 years, and there is a longer association with Artemis Tauropolis as well. There are some stories that tell us that bulls were also offered as sacrifice here, although it is unclear exactly what happens in the temple itself because we don't have any written documentation. We do have some mentions in plays, for Euripides, for example, who talks about shedding saffron robes at Braran, or shedding, symbolic of shedding youthful childhood experience behavior at Braran and becoming women of marriageable age. Oh. Lastly, I also put here a recipe for any of you that bake. I thought I would leave you on a less bloody note. So there are numerous examples of honey cakes that are offered for the goddess Artemis, especially in March and April, which is one of her biggest festivals. There are people that continue to make these honey cakes, but there is a long tradition that argues that because a lot of these festivals happen at night, because some of the cakes are presented in between torches, and because once a year the cakes may have had a torch, small torch, candle on it, and people blew that out in sacrifice to Artemis, that this may have been the very first birthday cakes that ever existed. Now the Swedes claim that they have the very first birthday cakes that ever existed. But the Greeks every now and then will say, well, we've had these honey cakes to Artemis for a very long time. There is a festival, Elaphobos, which honors the rescue of 300 Corinthian boys by the Sameans. The story goes that these boys were captured and they were being taken to another place to be castrated. And as they crossed through Samos, the Sameans were really outraged at all these boys going to be sacrificed. And so they told them to hide in the sanctuary of Artemis at Samos. And the Corinthians thought they could starve them out. And so the young Samean youths would dance around the temple at night with these honey cakes that they made and circle the temple so that the boys could come out and snatch a honey cake and eat it. And they did it for so long and for so many nights that the Corinthians gave up on the boys, left them, and left. And so the Sameans were able to return the boys to their homes. And from then on, we have this festival of honey cakes, one of them. And so if you like to bake, this is a QR code for a YouTube video on how to make these honey cakes. I've had friends who made them, and they're really, really delicious. I don't bake, but I do like to eat sweet things. And that's it. If you would like to follow my podcast, The Goddess Project, I talk about a bunch of goddesses and a bunch of sacrifices and some monsters and some scary things. So there's a QR code for that. No surprise. Thank you so much for listening to my talk.